Hello, and welcome to the Extraordinary People podcast. Today we're on with Jacob Kerr. Jacob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you for having me on. I am Jacob Kerr. I wrote a book called Atlanticism, A Path Forward to Peace, Progress, and Prosperity in the 21st Century.
I love that. And you've described to me Atlanticism. We've spoken about it. But why don't you give a brief overview for the audience who may not have heard of this before?
Yeah, so Atlanticism is the belief that North America, specifically the US and Canada, historically at least, and Europe should have closer ties. Historically, these were political and security, but they're evolving to become more economic, environmental, social, etc., etc. And over time, Atlanticism there are some forms going back further back, like the Council of Foreign Relations, the League of Nations to some extent, could be seen as Atlanticist post World War One. But going forward, I believe that we're going to see more stronger ties, if not an outright more centralized governance or management of the North Atlantic region.
Interesting. So is this sort of like a globalist take? What separates it from globalism?
It potentially could be a more globalist take. Because there's basically two paths we can go down if we continue Atlanticism. Either it's just more collaboration, stronger institutions that already exist, or these institutions and ties evolve towards an actual, like, more centralized management. Uh, so people do express concerns about losing sovereignty. And I think these are definitely questions for further out. Uh, but I would say that these are more less globalist in a global sense and more of a regional uh, sense of we're just evolving power to where it naturally goes. One of my main theses is that power used to be, not all the time, but most of the time, very localized. So you had dukes, knights, lords, castles. The Holy Roman Empire was a great example of this. How you had hundreds of different little kingdoms where power actually lied. Then, because of demographic trends, technology trends, other things happening, power naturally evolved to the nation state level. So England took over the British Isles, Prussia took over all of Germany, et cetera, et cetera. But because of trends that are happening today, the past few decades, demographic, economic, technology, et cetera, we're going to see power evolve this century towards the civilizational state. So, like, the Arab League is kind of a weak example of this. India and China are both nation and civilizational states. They've been around for a very long time. The African Union, the European Union are examples of these civilizational states starting to form. And I think the United States, we're strong enough to kind of be on our own. But if we do, we risk the possibility of losing a lot of prosperity, a lot of our existing power. So if we want to keep that power, that prosperity, that peace, our current standards of living, et cetera, our current status, we're going to have to join a team, whether that's the North American Union or the more of an Atlanticist Union or European Union. That's up to us and our kids to decide. But I think we have to, if we want to keep our current status in the world, we're going to have to join a larger team.
Interesting. So why is the US not strong enough on its own?
We only have about 300, I think it's about 330 million people. But like Africa has 1 billion people, China 1.4 billion, India's up there as well. Europe's 400 or 500 million. I forget what South America's union's called, but there's a lot of people down there as well. The Middle East, along with North Africa, that's a lot of people as well. So we'll definitely, if we keep our current mindset, it'll be a multipolar world, and we'll be one of the poles. But I don't know if as a country, if we're able to, because we've had this, ever since post World War II, we've been the top dog for about 80 something years. And we're definitely going to lose some ability to make the world the way we want to make it with foreign policy or the tools just on our own. So if we want to continue to influence events, we're going to have to join a bigger team. It's kind of like the Revolutionary War. So New York was pretty big, but if just New York by itself left the British Empire, they're not strong enough to resist the British Empire. It took all 13 colonies working together with solidarity to form the United States of America. So at the end of the day, we are big, we are strong. We may kind of be technically the top kid on the block, but we're not gonna have the same influence and ability to shape our own destiny unless we re-actualize our identity into a higher form.
So, what makes the European Union a strong candidate to join?
I think the EU is an institution that already exists. Sure, like every institution, it has flaws, things we all may agree or disagree with on specific things here and there. But I think that the European Union is a strong economic bloc. We're seeing post the Russia-Ukraine war that's going on, regardless of what side one is on, Europe has united more. Uh, Germany, France, Poland, Finland, Sweden joining NATO. I know NATO is more of a transatlantic thing, but as a whole, we're seeing Europe unite more and more. More talks of an actual like European army happening as well. So we have to like this is a future bloc that a lot of people had doubts about pre this war. The euro was kind of just like stagnant. There was a lot of internal tension. There's always will be internal tension in Europe because of the dynamics, but I think in terms of like joining a team, it's an institution that already exists, and its popularity domestically in Europe is growing. It has a lot of potential going into the future, especially with some reforms that are coming online.
Do you think it's a risk that both the US and Europe have a lot of migration of other from other countries? Do you think that poses any sort of a threat to the countries, or do you think that's good?
This has been going on for a while, and I mean it's a good question because there's always the eternal debate of, especially like in Western countries in East Asia, this doesn't happen. They're not they have different thoughts on immigration versus us. But I definitely think most people I talk to, whether they're left or right or center, would agree that having individuals that are higher educated or more skilled, there's definitely positives to that. But I think that's a very complicated subject. Definitely, some individuals aren't able to assimilate, aren't assimilating. Some are benefiting economically, some aren't. And that's a good question I don't exactly have an answer to at this time. But I would stress that any immigration should serve to not only economically benefit the country or the civilizational state, but also not harm the social harmony. Because this century is going to be a very tough century with climate change, geopolitical events, possible resource shortages, other things. We have to make sure that we have a strong internal domestic harmony to be able to overcome these challenges. And we have to make sure that immigration doesn't hurt our social harmony. And I don't know what that looks like exactly policy wise, but I'll just stress over and over and over again, we must maximize social harmony internally.
What are some ways to maximize social harmony?
That's another good question as well. I would say there's different ways of looking at this because of social media. There's pros and cons to social media, but there's definitely a lot of internal fighting and feuding, not just politically, but also in terms of just like the genders, class, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that one thing we could do, especially with like younger people who are under 18, is to maybe limit social media access to those individuals, because a lot of us are older, we've been exposed already to this. But I think younger people should have this sort of I don't want to have nostalgia because we can't go back exactly all the way in time. But there was a time that even I remember in middle school, there was no social media. It's just, kids playing on the playground, having a great time. Sure, there's, fights here and there, but there wasn't like the constant drama online, because the drama stayed at school. It didn't follow you to your house. So I blame social media for a lot. It's not any particular individual per se. It's just an institutional macro phenomena. I think we really have to look at regulating social media for younger people so that they can not. Because a lot of people have these they see other people online that they perceive as higher status or wherever else, and they feel sad for not being able to obtain that. Especially a lot of young women, they go online, they get bullied, they are bombarded with unrealistic messages of certain things, and I think this is very detrimental to the mental health of younger people. And we have to look at the root cause and realize we have to regulate social media, especially for younger people, and possibly, you know, even ban it for under certain ages so they can enjoy their childhood uh, and not be, not face. Because if you have these constant bombardments, these constant messages, this constant social pressure and peer pressure 24/7, that's going to create more conflict, and we don't want that. That's going to reduce social harmony. So we want to look at that's. There's many other things we can do as well, many other things, but that's one thing I would look at.
Yeah. So you mentioned that population, going back to when you're talking about the different powers in the world, you mentioned population as the number one. Is there a way to beat a larger population, even with a smaller population? Is it just increasing the productivity of your people?
Of course, yeah, the British Empire. I'm not saying it was good per se, but the British Empire ruled India for 200 years. And they're like maybe 1% of the population there. With the I think the Opium Wars, I think is what it's called. The British Empire forced China, which I think at a time had technically had a bigger economy because of their technology and productivity edge. The British Navy and some of their, I'm assuming Marines or whatever they were called back then, forced China to accept trade deals that they didn't want to trade or have. So definitely productivity, uh, making massive investments in human capital, doing other things like that could definitely help a smaller country. But we are seeing because of globalization, the easier access to technology, we're seeing these, the technology gap, the power gap that exists between the British Empire and India or China is shrinking. It's going to continue to shrink as well.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess, do you have any criticisms for the European Union? What would be reasons not to join?
I think one of the main reasons is for a lot of votes to require unanimous 100% consent. I think that's really unrealistic because a small country could hold up the entire process. Uh, that'd be like the Senate in the United States. I get the idea of a supermajority, and I think in some cases a case can be made for needing a supermajority to get certain things passed. But having 100% consent amongst the nations or the parties to agree, especially if you have 28, if you have 3, 4, 5 people or countries, that's one thing. But 25 countries and growing, that's not realistic. So in order for us to join the EU, there'd have to be some definitely internal amendments to making certain laws, procedures, a supermajority versus 100% agreement. That's one of the things that I would criticize for. Plus, the EU is a monetary union as well, not a fiscal union. And some people may view that as a pro. A lot of libertarians may see that as a pro. But if you have an entity that big, you want to have both a unified or at least linked monetary policy and fiscal policy so you can coordinate certain actions. We saw this with the European debt crisis. Germany and Southern Europe wanted very different things. But Germany was also bankrolling European Union, pretty much subsidizing these other countries. We saw a lot of tension there as well because there's no actual unified fiscal policy. And we'd have to, I don't know what that looks like, but at the end of the day, we'd have to have some agreements on fiscal things like security, procurements, or space, energy, infrastructure, agreements on immigration, migration, those sorts of stuff.
So would you see Europe moving towards America in terms of its policies, or America moving closer to Europe? Because they'd probably have to agree, right?
Yeah, I think it'll be both. I really do see at some point soon America adopting some form of the European Union's data protection laws. I know a lot of cities and states in the U.S. are moving towards that, so I definitely see that happening more and more. On a energy or environmental issues, I see it being more of a mixed bag because Europe, because of the war, has had a lot of the oil and gas cut off from Russia, and they definitely don't want to get back onto it. And as somebody who is an environmentalist, yeah, I like solar, I love nuclear, I love hydro, but oil and natural gas are realistically going to be part of the energy for the next few decades at least. And in the US and Canada, we have a ton of natural gas, a ton of oil. And Europe might have to, I don't know, by country per country or as a whole, what their specifics are on environmental policy. But we're just got to be more exporting of our energy to them short term, medium term at least, to make up for the gaps. And not only them decommissioning some nuclear plants in Germany, but also too, if like the less gas, less oil, less natural gas coming in from Russia, it's going to probably be permanently offline as well. So I think environmental issues going to be a mixed bag, but data protection, I definitely see us going more in their direction.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. What about healthcare? How do you think that would be solved between the two?
Definitely for the foreseeable future, it would definitely be nation state based because even the European Union, they don't have a single healthcare system. Some countries have a fully nationalized both hospitals and insurance, or just one or the other. Some countries, it's very highly regulated. I think, if I recall, France is a very mixed bag where everybody has single payer, but most people have supplemental private health insurance. So that definitely it'll still be a nation state issue for a while, but it's very possible that very long term there could be a more unified healthcare structure. I would say though that Europe does keep the healthcare costs under control way better than we do in America. I think we spend 17-18% of our economy on healthcare. They spend, depending on the country, 7 to 11%. And there definitely are pros and cons. Like there's definitely instances in Europe where people have to wait a long line for healthcare. It's definitely a downside. Uh, there's also downsides to our healthcare system as well. I don't have an exact solution for what that looks like, but I think short term we will keep what we have in America, whether we go public option, what we have right now. We're going to still have sovereignty over our healthcare policy.
Okay. So paint me a picture of what happens if America decides not to join the EU in, like, let's say 50 to 100 years.
I think America will still be one of the biggest poles in the world, but will become increasingly more I don't want to use the term isolated per se, but we'd be more focused on just like North America versus the whole globe or even things above us like space colonization or etc. Because we won't have the resources or population to be able to. We'll still go to space. We'll still probably have some space colonies out there, uh, but we're going to continue to slowly, stagnate or at least grow a lot slower. Post World War II, we grew a lot. It made sense because we had a lot of, we were the only pole at the time. We grew, I think, 5-10% a year for a while. Post Cold War, we grew a lot to the 90s as well. But I think, we have to realize that America isn't going to expand infinitely on the US because we've really, got half a continent from East Coast to West Coast. There's not really a lot of room to expand. And at the same time, even if we have high levels of immigration, we're talking about 400 million people in the country, maybe 450 by the end of the century, perhaps. That's still a big chunk, but it's not big enough to compete with a continent of 3 billion, 4 billion people. Africa, probably that many people by then. India, 2 billion. China may decline, but there's still going to be a lot of people there too. So we'll continue to lose influence. We'll lose the ability to use military policy to achieve what we want to achieve. We'll lose the ability to use economic policy and monetary policy to achieve what we want to achieve abroad. And we're going to be more dependent on other continents, civilizational states, and countries that may or may not have our best interests at heart.
So would you say that another path instead of joining another power is increasing our birth rate to like increase our population dramatically, or do you think that's not really on the table?
I'm definitely open to it. Outside of a few exceptions, though, most countries, our first world countries, haven't seen a huge birth rate increase yet. Israel, I think, is the only example of a first world country that has managed to keep a above replacement level birth rate. That's for a variety of reasons. But we're seeing, it's, I mean, I definitely hope it can be true someday, but I don't see it as being as feasible short term or medium term. Other countries in Europe have tried certain things with like tax policy or subsidies. And this hasn't worked as effectively so far. Might temporarily increase the birth rate by 0.05 or by zero point 0.1 temporarily, but then it starts to slow back down. And I think at some point in the future, the solutions to this will involve not just extending life expectancy, but extending fertility as well, and especially in women. So instead of dropping off at, let's say, 35, 40, their fertility is expanded more towards 45, 50. So I see this as an option as well. And I think at a certain point too, urbanization does usually kill your birth rate. And I don't know, but urbanization has so many benefits as well. Besides, there's economic growth, there's people getting together to talk about ideas, there's productivity, there's interesting things happening in cities. But unfortunately, they do kill off the birth rate quite rapidly. Cities do that. Urbanization does that. And I hope we can increase our birth rate up to a higher level, but I don't see that as being feasible short term. We're going to have to be very creative and look towards, I don't know, maybe perhaps in the European Union, there could be experiments where every country does their own little thing. They're given certain incentives, and we could just see what system works best uh, with that as well. But we'll have
Mm-hmm.
to wait to see what happens there.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious about what Israel did right. Do you know what worked for them?
It's a combination of things. So, like, even from what I've studied, a lot of it is they're very religious population having a bunch of kids. So, like, I think it's like 3, 4, or 5 kids per family. But sometimes these families they're usually exempt from serving in the military as well. And they have a lot of uh, benefits attached to them. But the more secular people in that country as well, they still have a birth rate about 1.92, 2.1. But at the end of the day, if a large part of the population has a high birth rate, is basically exempt from military service in a very hostile region, that is a potential liability as well. So Israel's going to have to figure out if they're going to have to at some point get these people to contribute more to the country. But I don't know what that looks like exactly, how they pull that off, because you can't sustain. Because Israel is a very, very small country. They're surrounded by potential adversaries, and it's a very tough part of the world, going back thousands of years. It's a very hostile part of the planet, so people constantly fight each other for every square inch. And at some point, the hyper religious Jews are going to have to not be given these exemptions in order to help the state out as a whole.
So it's almost like when times get tough, you can use like governments can leverage that to create an incentive to have kids, and that seems to work.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that statement. Yes.
Has that ever happened with any other countries?
I would say post World War II, there was a birth rate increase, not just the U.S. but Europe as well. So those tough times created post World War II created, people had stronger bonds, and they end up having a higher birth rate for a few years, a decade or so. I just don't see what sort of event could cause that to happen. Maybe a great war between us and China, but we would want to probably avoid that. That'd be very catastrophic for us and them. So finding ways of increasing the birth rate, increasing social harmony without a outside cataclysmic event is very hard, because we want to avoid that at all costs. Uh, so yeah, I'm not sure entirely.
It's almost like if society gets really comfortable, people get complacent, and
Yes,
there's less of an incentive to have a lot of kids because it's hard work.
exactly. Yep. I think that's why long term looking at increasing fertility periods or increasing like the years that women can have kids is going to be a great step forward in terms of increasing our fertility rate. Because nowadays, people love going out, socializing, but there's also a lot of student loan debt out there. Housing is really expensive, and at the end of the day, we have all these economic constraints and also social constraints. People want to have fun, they want to travel, but if they do all these things, they're not going to have kids. So I think realistically speaking, by the time people are 30, they kind of slow it down a little bit. But at that point, you have 10 years, 15 years to find a partner, have kids. So I think whatever company out there is looking to, increase the longevity or the period of women can have kids, extending it further and further out, they're going to make a bunch of money. So not to give investment advice because I'm not a financial advisor, but if you want to make a bunch of money in the stock market, find a company that's looking to increase female fertility, and that's gonna be a big thing in the next probably 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, as you say it, I was thinking about, we were talking about populations in the future,
Yeah.
and isn't it kind of like a race to the bottom where our population is not very big? It's probably going to shrink, at least for like excluding immigration population in the US. But won't other countries also have like a dramatically collapsing population just because their populations are getting very old right now, like in China or Japan? And then won't that cause them to shrink also substantially? And so, do you think that the proportions between the countries will stay the same, or are there some that are falling in population faster than others?
Oh, definitely East Asia is going to see a massive population drop off, at least during the first half of this century. Definitely Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they're going to see a massive drop off. China, they're going to probably see a drop off. But also, too, this is a civilization that's existed for thousands of years, and just like at a whim, I think they can, if they really want to, use authoritarian measures to get the birth rate up to a level they want to get up to. And I think that's very tragic. But this is China's history. They have a lot of ups and downs. They have many internal wars, many internal struggles as well. And as a people, as a civilization, as a culture, as an identity, I think that if they really wanted to, it'd be way easier for them to increase their birth rate, easier than what we think at least. Because their government, they have no problem with their government being more authoritarian to do certain things. And these are very dark possibilities, but China has had many ups and downs over the millennia. And I could definitely see their regime uh, doing things to force their birth rate up, things that we in the West would find bad or horrible or violation of civil liberties. Their regime will have no problem doing that over there.
What could that look like?
I could see the Chinese government doing a lot of just dark things, terrible things. I think at first they'll start more soft, like, oh, we'll give tax credits to people who have kids, but also tax people more who don't have kids. They'll start that way. And if that's not enough to get the birth rate up, they'll start. Uh, I could see them doing other things, like jailing people who don't have kids. They've done worse in the past, so I could definitely see the Chinese regime doing that. Jailing people who don't have kids, uh, maybe like building statues of people who do have kids. They've done crazier things in the past, so I could definitely, if the first option is a work of taxing people, punishing people who don't have kids, and then incentivizing heavily people who do have kids, I could see them. If that doesn't do the trick, I could see them going escalating up the ladder until they get the results that they want. So
Interesting. So that's kind of the downside. Well, I don't know if that's the downside of the US, but that's not something that we can really do here, right? I mean, what do you think is the furthest the US would go to increase the birth rate?
I think currently just like tax incentives, maybe like social things as well, like having more like paid holidays or having like a instead of Mother's Day having a Mother's Weekend or Mother's Week or a Father's Week or Father's Weekend, building statues of families and cities to kind of subconsciously you know push us on a population. I think these things, I don't know if they've been tried anywhere else before, but I could definitely see that being an option that people may pursue. But that's the furthest I can see things going in America or Europe. And I think that's a good thing that we're not going to, go further than certain things. I think it's good that we have a more, a less authoritarian culture, less, we're more, we definitely push, there's definitely nudges or pushing people a certain direction, but we're not going to be totalitarian and enforce certain edicts on people.
Hmm.
But
You mentioned using statues to influence the population. Has that ever been done in history?
oh, definitely, if like great leaders like Alexander the Great built statues everywhere. A lot of leaders that and people that go out create civilizations or expand their civilization. They build statues to enforce their rule or to send a message of, hey, we're this is who we are. I don't think it's been done in modern times, but if you see a giant statues in your downtown, uh, people are going to subconsciously get the message of, okay, this is who we are, and we're going to try to emulate, the posters, statues, so what's out there on social media, marketing, et cetera, et cetera. So I think statues could be a good, cheap, effective way of possibly getting the birth rate up. Just glorifying families, and I guess we'll have to test it out sometime.
Yeah. Okay, so how much does culture have a role in birth rates?
I think it can. I'm not sure on. It definitely probably can have an effect on birth rates. Having a culture that incentivizing it, promoting it, could definitely help out. So I think it's a combination of both economics and culture, along with other trends that can increase or decrease birth rates. But definitely, culture has a part. Nothing to go back to the past question. I think if people live in a very aesthetic place where it's very orderly, very clean. The skyscrapers and buildings look phenomenal. Things look good. Like there's maybe a nice cathedral. There's some nice skyscrapers and skylines. There's nice maintained roads. So things are running really well and look well. People will naturally be happier and have a hope for the future and have higher birth rates because people are very pessimistic about the future. They're not going to have kids. Look at Ukraine; they're getting bombed, destroyed. The birth rate is very low because people don't want to risk having kids in that environment. People are going to want to have kids if they have a positive future for themselves. Like Israel, for the most part, has seen and it's of course it's a very dangerous part of the world, but Israel still has a higher birth rate because they're a society that's still growing, still has a hope for the future. They're very optimistic. The older generations remember a past where Israel was weaker, and now Israel is stronger now. So they definitely there's that hope, that positive, that feeling of, hey, things are going to get better. The future is better. So we're going to have, we can have more kids because our kids are going to grow up better than we are. So we want to have them. If people think the future is dark and bleak, they're not going to want to put their kids through that. So they're not going to have kids in the first place. So I think having a more positive society where we're more optimistic, focusing on the positive things, that would definitely increase our birth rate as well. So having a positive culture would help with that, definitely.
Hmm. How would you manage the cultural clash between the US and the EU if they were to join?
I don't think there's much of a cultural clash. I think there's definitely some physical differences, but most people aren't going to be too tied up with that because Europe and America are very, very similar. Minus, some language differences, uh, maybe some like clothing and food differences as well. We're very similar to Europe. As a matter of fact, even like because of the European Union, the UK was a part of it. They left, but they still use English as a language to communicate with each other. So I definitely do. I think especially if time goes on, even if we don't join the European Union, I definitely see the EU becoming more and more English oriented, even without the UK in it, which is kind of ironic. But I see if anything, it's becoming more and more similar too, because the United States was effectively a more pan-European country for a long time. We had, first the Anglos and the Scots and the Irish, suddenly the Germans came, and then Southern Europeans came, and then other European groups came. So we're effectively having, for most of history, a European mutt country. And the EU is, because they're open borders and free trade and their increasing use of English, they're going to become their national differences are going to effectively go away over this century and possibly next century as well. So I see the EU, if anything, becoming more and more like America culturally, linguistically. And they're becoming a mutt continent. So it's like we're basically a mutt country. Most of groups like Anglos, Germans, Scandinavians, Italians, Spaniards, Slavs, French, etc., and we all intermixed. Europe's going to do the exact same thing as well with their populations with open borders and free trade, etc., etc.
Mhm. So is there a reason why Europe and not why like South America, for instance, or South and Central America?
Like, why would we join Europe versus the rest of America? Because I think we
Yeah.
already have we have thousands and thousands of institutions that already exist between us and Europe, going back mostly post-World War II, but also pre-World War II as well. These are everything from security to political to economic, environmental, energy, everything you can think of. There's some sort of transatlantic entity that does something in that regard. These institutions already exist. There's thousands of them. We're economically more tied with Europe than we are them as well. Mexico might be the exception, but with the rest of Latin America, we're tied with Europe than we are with them. We're politically more aligned. And NATO is already the security apparatus of the North Atlantic. It'd be easier for us to build upon NATO, build upon the European Union, build upon other institutions than it would be to just create new ones with Latin America. Plus, Europe's already a very developed continent with first world economies, high standards of living. So it'd be easier for us to collaborate with them, not just culturally, but also economically on bigger projects like infrastructure projects, a bridge from North America or a tunnel of some sort from North America to Europe, space colonization, working together on science technology. It'd be way easier for us for cultural reasons and economic reasons to work with them versus Latin America. But I think long term, there's a possibility of Latin America, at least certain countries, joining this Atlantis civilization. That's more long term. But I think over time, Latin America will become more and more westernized this century and next century. They could definitely become more and more integrated into our sphere.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, what does leadership look like between all of these like nations? Is there one president that's now in charge of all of the area?
That's a good question. I'm open to whatever people end up deciding. I think in reality, it's going to be a slow build. Like, it'd be kind of like the Articles of Confederation at first. Then there was a constitution. And then over time, power evolved more and more to the federal level. I think that's a realistic option for what could happen. So definitely people at first don't want to give up their sovereignty to this entity, which I completely understand. It'd be like back in the day when New York was giving up sovereignty to the Continental Congress or the Constitution. But I definitely think regardless of what happens, there's going to be some democratic inputs, which is a good thing. There's going to be some slowly evolving executive power, especially regards to security. And there would be more, I'm assuming, legislative power as well. But I think over time, this would be a slow power evolution over decades or a century or so. And I think that's going to happen regardless whether we do this consciously or not. This will happen whether we want to or not, because Europe is becoming more and more intermixed with itself, just like the United States was. So we're going to see basically two almost identical entities. Sure, there might be different fiscal policy, might be different monetary policy, we might have different healthcare systems per se, but in terms of, excuse me, the foundation, the culture, the identity, we're going to become just more and more alike over this century. And this would naturally lead to us having a stronger bond with each other, working together more on these international projects, et cetera, et cetera.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so what is paint me a picture of what the future looks like with the US and EU partnered.
I think we'll have a safer world in our own territories, like the U.S., Canada, and Europe. We're gonna have a lot more prosperity, a lot more order, a lot more control of our own lives, a lot more happiness. I think we're going to see more aesthetically pleasing infrastructure and stuff out there. We're going to see just a better world, a more environmentally friendlier world, a more secure North Atlantic. We're going to see many of us working together to go to the moon, go to Mars, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we're going to see a very optimistic, positive future with us and Europe joining together.
I like that. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt to partner and have more people. That can't be a bad thing.
I think if you were to do this today, even people would benefit a lot. Because imagine a lot of people in America, they love Europe, including me. They want to go over there, travel more. They want to possibly work over there. So we have an open border with Europe. It'll be easier to go over there, move over there, get a job over there. It'd be the same if, let's say, someone wants to move from Texas to Tennessee. They might have to update the driver's license, do some small paperwork here and there, but there's nothing preventing them from actually moving there. This is,
Mhm.
some small paperwork here and there. Imagine a future where anybody in the US can go to Europe and just like live there, work their rest of their lives, or vice versa. I think this would be very good for all parties involved.
Hmm. So what happens to the Constitution? Does that stay in place in America? Do we have to budge a little bit to blend with the EU? What happens to the Second Amendment, first of all, or for example?
Yeah, so I think we'll definitely keep it here in America. I think it's kind of like Germany and France have their constitutions or some equivalent of it, but there's basically just a slow evolution towards a more unified structure. I don't know what that looks like exactly, but I do think we will keep our constitution for a while. But that's a good question on Second Amendment, though, because a lot of countries over there have more regulations of guns and everything else. So that's a good question. I don't have an answer to. So I guess I'll have to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that can change in the US. I think it's like past a
Yeah.
certain critical point, which I think I don't think I can even state publicly, but it is what it is. It's
Yeah.
difficult to change.
It's definitely baked into the equation. So I don't, but I think this will be a minor issue. I mean, there might be some conflict amongst, our Second Amendment versus what they have in Europe. There definitely will be tension, but I think this would be minor. And I think more importantly, the elites in both America and Europe have an incentive to make this happen as well. Like they want unification of the North Atlantic. There's a reason why Council of Foreign Relations, Trilateral, Bilderberg, they get together constantly, and this is kind of what they want. So I think if we can, you know, say, hey, we have a positive vision for the future. We want more prosperity. We want people to be happier. We want these things. Then the elites, there's elites buy into it. There's buy-in from the population. There's buy-in from business and consumers. Buy-in from both workers and the managers. I think this is unification would be a win-win for everybody involved.
Hmm. I saw an article titled that the globalization benefits the top 10% the most. I think that's something related to how, when the Walmart comes in, it kicks out the mom and pop shop. And so you have this trend towards the bigger companies, the elite who own them, and less sort of strength in the middle class. Is that a trend you would expect to happen with this partnership?
Possibly, but I think having because definitely in America that's been the case to some extent. In Europe, though, they've had more uh, redistribution of wealth and other policies to help mitigate these sorts of things. So I think ideally, what we would want is to create uh, an idea that's been thrown around is a sovereign wealth fund that everybody benefits from, kind of like Saudi Arabia or Norway. And all the resources that we have in the North Atlantic, the energy resources, actual resources, manufactured goods we have, a certain percentage would be given to the sovereign wealth fund, and over time it would pay out dividends to all citizens. That's been an idea that's been thrown around. And to keep corporations from outsourcing jobs to other nations, we could have eternal free trade and free movement of people, but very heavy restrictions on outside trade. Because in Canada, US, Europe, we have everything we need: resources, human capital, intellectual capital, the infrastructure, innovations, the patents. We have everything we need within our borders. So we don't necessarily need to trade with other entities per se or as much. So to prevent companies from outsourcing jobs, bringing in cheap labor to undermine our standards of living with our wages by increasing the supply of labor artificially, we could definitely create regulations that prevent that from happening. That's an option people have talked about that I'm very open and sympathetic to.
Wouldn't
So
a
we definitely want a
criticism
strong middle class. Oh, go ahead.
Right, right. No, I agree. But wouldn't a criticism to that be that Saudi Arabia and Norway are both very ethnically homogenous, and that works less well when you have a very diverse society?
That's definitely something to think about. Many people probably do think about it. Uh, I think it's definitely a combination of factors that definitely may be one of the factors. That if you have a stronger, if people, because people naturally, look at high school, people naturally amalgamate groups. Like you have like the jocks, you have like maybe the golf kids here, yeah, maybe like the emo kids here, the cheerleader squad there. So people definitely naturally, you know, tend to form their own like little people do naturally in some ways have more collaboration, more of a spirit, a stronger shared identity if they're in that sort of environment. So it's definitely something to think about. I would definitely say that.
Yeah, yeah. I think that it's interesting to see the differences. Like it's almost like diverse versus homogenous countries need to be managed differently.
There's definitely pros and cons to both. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. It's very interesting. So I'm
Yeah.
guessing you're anti-Brexit.
Yeah. It's funny because originally, like, if you asked me 6, 7 years ago, I was more of a definitely like, America first type, but I've evolved to be Atlanticist. So I think Brexit was a terrible decision with hindsight. We see in Britain, because I think the main criticism of joining the EU was that they're worried about immigration. They're worried about immigration, losing jobs, fishing rights. Uh, they're worried about contributing too much, taking stuff like that. And I think post Brexit, they've actually seen immigration increase. So a lot of people that were pro Brexit, the policy outcome was the opposite of what they wanted. I would say that. And two, I think Britain, they're back in the day they were a great power. Now they're more of a middle power, and they're going to have to. They definitely, America, we could kind of on our own do okay. Britain definitely, if they want to keep their status, they definitely need to join a team, whether it's the European Union or maybe a greater Anglosphere with Australia, New Zealand, Canada. They can do what they want to do, but if they want to keep their standard of living, their status, their peace, progress, prosperity, power, they definitely need to join a bigger team. And I know they left the EU, but I think they should reconsider joining the European Union for a variety of reasons. It's also backfires spectacularly. They're everything they want to accomplish. People who are pro Brexit, they want to, not all of them, but a lot of them want to reduce immigration, reduce dependency, become more independent. If anything, the opposite has happened since 2016 in every regard. It's been a complete uh, backfire, a complete disaster. So, yeah.
Hmm. So would you recommend that Britain joins the US in a twist, in a historical twist?
That would be very ironic. Uh, And that would be pretty funny if they did. If let's say England became a state, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland became a state, or became four different states in the U.S. That would be very ironic and something to definitely think about. I think what's more likely is they either rejoin the European Union or let's say there's a greater Anglosphere that forms. So instead of us joining the North American Union, having a North American Union or a EU we join, I think what's more likely than them joining us that way would be a greater Anglosphere forming where we all have a common language, a lot of common historical ties, and to have an Anglo civilizational state. I think that's way more likely than them joining us in that way, but it's very fun to think about because it would, like you mentioned, it would be very ironic for because we are the child of them pretty much historically, and then for them to they had their empire, they've declined, and they finally just throw in the towel and move in with their kids. That would be very very funny.
Yeah. So, what are the possible concessions that you would expect with it's almost like a merger? Like, what would we have to give up? And I know a lot of the positives, but what would you expect to lose in terms of this deal?
I know the U.S. is pivoting more and more towards the East Pacific and has in the Middle East. In the 2000s pivoted there, but we're going to have to. We will give up some security sovereignty to this higher entity. I think we have a lot of shared interests that offset that loss, but we'll have to collaborate more with Europe. We'll have to definitely at first 5 to 10 years, we'll have to give a bunch of money to Europe to help them build the militaries back up to the 2% level or higher level. Even now with the geopolitical situation, they're going to have to probably increase that 2.5% maybe. So definitely will be lots of foreign aid going to Europe to help them beef up their defense budgets. There's a possibility of us losing some money with that. Besides, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything else off the top of my head that we would lose per se. And I think that cost would pay for itself long term to have a strong, military in Europe that's beefed up, could deal with Russia or whatever else comes their way. What do you
Mm-hmm.
think would be a possible side effect?
Um, well, I think loss of culture might be one of them. Like, I don't know who gets the upper hand, but if America gets control of England, I feel like there will just be even more blatant globalization than exists today. And I don't think that's a good thing. Like in America, our culture is not one that preserves history. Like everything is about new and better. And a lot of the good things in Europe are the preservation of the old, and the culture is different from that perspective. There's a lot more preservation, at least so there's a lot more history to preserve. So I'm worried if America is combined with Europe that Europe will lose that historical charm and become a lot more like US, like the US.
I can definitely see that
From
being
a
the case. I think because you mentioned the globalization, I can definitely see that being the case. So I do think we have to be very. This is why I think we have to be very purposeful about what we're doing. So I think it's going to happen regardless whether we want to or not. So it's very important for us to make sure that this process is purposeful and planned out so these things don't happen.
right. Yeah, and maybe it's full merger like the 51st, 52nd states. And maybe it's more of like a series of trade and immigration agreements and just make it sort of easier to travel between the two, rather than an ownership model where it's like owned by the same group. There might be a middle ground there.
I can definitely see that being the case. I think initially we want to just focus on just the security apparatus, so like having more centralized military, and then we can focus on that stuff later. But I definitely think the first steps towards this Atlantis as a super state should be focusing on the military and the security apparatus to make sure we maintain peace, because we can't maintain peace and order in the North Atlantic. It's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have to have food, shelter, and water, and then you can build up on that. So I definitely would
Yeah,
agree that we should, like, I definitely agree with you that we should be mindful of those sorts of things. So I would definitely stress that as Atlanta says, we should focus on that foundation level first before going up towards those
yeah,
levels.
yeah. You're thinking a lot deeper than I am, and I admittedly haven't had as much time to think about it. But yeah, from a purely almost a war game perspective, America becomes a larger target to hit right away in this sort
True.
of environment. So, the weakest link in the chain, now because America is very strong because it's isolated geographically, so that like I know at least that much. So
True.
this puts more space to attack America in Europe, right? Like they become a proxy for attacking us. So that's why you're saying the spend in military has to increase, right?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to, because I think in US we're at 3.5%, something like that. In Europe, they're a lot lower than ours. Some countries are above 2%, like Poland. Some are lower. But we need to help out the countries that are lower. And I think we have to be very positive with helping them out versus negative. A lot of the past, 7, 8 years, people have been very critical of Europe. And I get, maybe there's some bad decisions over in Europe on some things, but I think we have to be very positive and forward looking with them versus being critical. It's kind of like, let's say, you have two friends that are, one's trying to convince the other what's in their best interest. Attacking them, being mean, writing mean tweets about them is not going to, make them want to, work together on certain things. We have to be very proactive and very conscious of how we talk about this with Europe.
Okay. Yeah, how do you feel about Greece joining the EU? I know it's kind of a dated conversation topic,
Yeah.
but we can kind of see how it turned out.
Yeah. I mean, Greece itself, thankfully, it's a small country, so it's not going to be as much of a bigger problem. But I think Greece symbolically joining is a good thing, at least symbolically, because Greece is a cradle of Western civilization. You have Athens, you have the temples, the culture, the history, and also too, it's very strategically located in the middle of more towards like the east end, but still the middle of Mediterranean. So definitely, I would encourage our politicians to be more responsible in certain ways. Uh, it's really unfortunate what happened there about 10, 15 years ago. Very unfortunate their politicians made some bad decisions. But Greece is symbolically the cradle of our civilization. And it's very important that, Greece, Italy, so like, Rome, Athens, more modern times, Paris, London, Berlin. It's very important symbolically that we keep these countries in the orbit. That's what I would say.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah. Would you say though that joining the EU has been a net positive or net negative for Greece?
Definitely initially it was a net positive because it got a lot of inflows. Uh, Unfortunately, a lot of politicians mismanaged it and bad things happened. But I think it's been overall, it was at least initially a good thing. And I think going to the future, it'll be a good thing as well as the European Union as Europe as a whole. There's more, movement of people are intermixing much different nationalities. I think, European Union going forward is going to be a very great institution to build within. And I think, Greece has a very positive future in the European Union as it goes forward.
Okay. Yeah, really interesting.
And then
Cool. Well, I think
go ahead.
yeah. No, you go.
Then hopefully too we can expand the EU more eastward. because I know if like Ukraine, hoping to get Ukraine someday, then hopefully Russia at some point they don't have a adversarial Eurasian authoritarian regime in place. Hopefully they have a more democratic and more pro-West government in place. Because Russia has been very tied to the West historically, especially with Peter the Great. We built St. Petersburg. It feels very unfortunate that they haven't really been the past, since basically World War One. They haven't been in the orbit, and I think we have to we have to find positive ways after Putin, of course, because with Putin, there's no way we're going to negotiate with him. But post Putin, I want us to reach out to Russia and say, hey, we've had differences in the past. What happened if Ukraine was completely unacceptable? What your government did to Ukraine was bad. What Putin did to Ukraine was bad. But we want, now that he's gone in the future, a date, we want to work together to bring you guys into the orbit, because Russia has its own rich natural history, natural resources, a lot of land mass, especially with climate change being more and more a thing this century. There's going to be a lot of good fertile farmland in Russia to take advantage of. So if Russia can have a pro-West, democratic Atlanticist regime, or at least open Atlanticist regime versus a Eurasian regime that rejects Atlanticism, then I look forward to a future where we can, post Putin incorporate Russia.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a very interesting additional take. Yeah. I think that's. Is there anything that we're missing from the picture of what your vision for Atlanticism?
I think we talked a lot. I think very long term, given our economic mass, because if we have, if U.S., Canada, Europe, and then post Putin, Russia, if we all work together for our rich natural resources, our massive land space, at that point we have almost 1 billion people, at least several hundred million, and a high standard of living, a lot of technology and intellectual human capital. We can definitely work towards colonizing the heavens at that point. So I think we can, because if you want to like terraform Mars or terraform Venus or go to other star systems, you're going to have a big, massive economic base to work from. If, let's say, Singapore is a very rich country, but they're very small. So I think in terms of, maybe like later this century or next century, we can definitely work together to start the process of terraforming Mars, terraforming Venus, going to other star systems. Because I think the solar system is so rich in natural resources. And we have a great potential as a people, as Atlanticists, to go out and make new and even make better worlds if we want to. Sure, it would take decades or centuries, maybe even millennia or two. But I think, as a people, if we do get our birth rates up, we're going to have space to expand to. And we want that to be in other planets. Again, in the past, we had empires in the past. But I think we can have a better outlook in terms of how we expand as a people, in terms of living space. We should be looking towards, the moon, Mars, and Venus for these sorts of population expansions. So I think as a planet, we have a lot of diversity on the planet we want to keep. A lot of people have their own cultures or rich histories or rich perspectives, their languages or religions. We want to keep these as they are. We want to maintain. We don't want to replace them. We want to maintain the rich biodiversity of the human race. So we want to get our birth rates up. Sure, yes. We want to expand as a civilization. Yes, because if you're not expanding, you're dying. But we want to expand this. We want to shape this in terms of space. So we are, and plus two, it'll be a challenge. We've already had these empires in the past. We've proven we can't do this. Like, what's the point? It was a lot of what we did was horrible and bad. Sure, there's pros and cons in some cases, but we should aim for a higher challenge to achieve. Expanding and colonizing Mars, Venus, other star systems is something that we should try to do. Because even if we don't do it, or if we, let's say, get delayed a lot, we're still going to make massive achievements in terms of technology, working together, having a common shared identity. We're going to have a very if we, aim for the stars, hit the moon, even if we fail at some of our objectives with space colonization, we're going to achieve a lot of great things for us in terms of like, technology, happiness, having a positive future for society, a positive outlook, people being happier, having a hope for the future. Yeah, we're expanding. We're going to do X, Y, and Z on these other worlds. So I have hope. So I'm going to have more kids. I'm going to be happier. I'm going to, contribute more social capital to my nonprofit locally, my local church, my local neighborhood association, my local school board. I'm going to contribute more because I'm more happy. I'm more positive about our future. So I think having that futuristic outlook, going towards the stars, is our final destiny.
I love it. That's so inspiring. Thank you, Jacob. This has been a great
Yeah.
conversation.
Oh yeah. Likewise. Do you have any other questions or comments or concerns?
No, I would love to do another one at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is so fun.
And definitely, let me know. If people in the audience have questions, I can definitely answer those questions as well. I'm definitely open to that. So, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We'll talk to you soon.